Welcome back to Military Report Mode, where we dissect the absolute bleeding edge of global military strategy and power projection. Today, we are taking you inside a classified, multi-domain masterclass in modern warfare, a scenario where the United States military did not just defeat an adversary, but completely manipulated them into orchestrating their own absolute destruction. The geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East was just thrust into an irreversible spiral, and it all began with what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps thought was a flawless, strategic checkmate. But in reality, they had just swallowed the most expensive, highly orchestrated bait in the history of naval warfare. At exactly 3:47 in the morning, just off the glittering coastline of Dubai, the supertanker Al Sami glided through the pitch-black waters of the Persian Gulf like a silent, colossal ghost. Carrying 2 million barrels of highly flammable crude oil, the massive vessel was a floating economic artery. Suddenly, the dead silence of the night was shattered by a piercing, high-pitched mechanical screech ripping through the humid air. An Iranian Shahed suicide drone, flying mere feet above the dark waves to avoid radar detection, plowed straight into the heavy steel deck of the supertanker. The explosion was deafening. In just 12 seconds, the reinforced steel hull was violently ripped open. Thick, toxic black smoke billowed into the sky, and millions of gallons of crude oil began leaking into the turbulent waters of the Gulf. The $200 million supertanker instantly turned into a slow-burning, ecological time bomb. The towering flames on the deck illuminated the night sky, casting an eerie orange glow across the water. By striking the Kuwaiti-flagged tanker, Tehran intended to send a definitive, undeniable message to the global economy. They wanted to prove that the United States Navy could no longer guarantee the safety of its Gulf allies. The Iranian strategy was a classic, brutal overwhelm and annihilate playbook. The Iranian generals calculated that a massive explosion, coupled with a catastrophic oil spill, would force the United States Fifth Fleet to rush directly into the narrow, restricted kill zone of the Strait of Hormuz to secure the area and conduct rescue operations. The Revolutionary Guard was waiting in the shadows. They were prepared to swarm the American rescue fleet with hundreds of low-cost suicide drones, while Ghadir-class midget submarines, acting as silent predators, waited on the shallow seabed to deploy magnetic limpet mines against the hulls of the American destroyers. It was supposed to be a historic, bloody slaughter. But there was one catastrophic flaw in the Iranian plan. The Al Sami was not a victim. It was a completely empty, remote-controlled ghost ship. Think of it as a $200 million Trojan horse floating in a sea of crude oil. Exactly 3 hours before the drone strike, the entire human crew of the supertanker had been covertly evacuated via stealth helicopters, operating completely blacked out. The manual helm was replaced by a highly sophisticated, encrypted remote piloting system tied directly to United States naval intelligence. The United States had intentionally, meticulously nudged the massive tanker 2 nautical miles off its designated safe transit corridor. It was a golden, irresistible bait dangled right in front of Iran's naval ego. Tehran did not just take the bait, they swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. The trap was now sprung, and the United States fleet was sitting right at the center, ready to unleash absolute hell. The silence over the Persian Gulf in the minutes following the explosion was not a stalemate. It was the deep, calculating breath of an apex predator, waiting for the final spark. Iran thought they were closing the trap, completely unaware they had just stepped into a masterfully orchestrated, multi-domain kill box. At 3:48 in the morning, exactly 60 seconds after the hull of the supertanker was breached, the United States military flipped the switch on a global digital panopticon. From the freezing, frictionless vacuum of the thermosphere, Lockheed Martin KH-11 keyhole reconnaissance satellites, the most expensive and highly classified orbital telescopes ever created by human hands, violently reoriented their massive mirrors. Looking down from space with an astonishing 10-centimeter optical resolution, the KH-11 is essentially the Eye of Sauron on a silicon diet, capable of distinguishing the exact make and model of an enemy rifle from 200 miles above the Earth. Simultaneously orbiting thousands of feet above the Gulf, the Northrop Grumman E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, the undisputed airborne quarterback of the United States Fifth Fleet, began its work. The massive, rotating radar dome on the back of the aircraft began streaming gigabytes of raw, unfiltered telemetry data through Link 16. This is a high-speed, completely jam-resistant tactical data network that fed the information directly into the Aegis combat system of the American cruisers and destroyers waiting in the dark. By 3:49 in the morning, the entire Strait of Hormuz was rendered in high definition, digital clarity on American radar screens. Iran attempted to use physical stealth, hiding their massive swarms of drones and fast-attack fiberglass boats among dozens of civilian fishing trawlers and commercial cargo ships. To a standard, antiquated radar system, this looks like a chaotic, unreadable mess of white noise. It was Tehran's way of using human shields to tie the hands of American fire control officers. But the United States Navy countered with a devastating masterstroke: Aegis Silent Mode. Instead of blasting the area with active, heavy radar pulses that would alert the Iranians that they were being tracked, the Aegis system relied entirely on the advanced Hawkeye's artificial intelligence-driven behavioral analysis. The supercomputers went to work. While the civilian ships moved in steady, predictable, linear transit lanes, the Iranian military assets were instantly and permanently tagged with hostile red icons the exact millisecond they performed abnormal, aggressive maneuvers. Sudden bursts of speed, erratic weaving through the waves, and loitering in restricted zones immediately gave them away. The digital fog of war did not just clear, it turned into a highly prioritized automated target list. Iran was desperately trying to blend into a crowd, completely unaware that American artificial intelligence had already mapped their digital DNA. At 3:52 in the morning, the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier violently erupted. The humid night air was shattered by the deafening, bone-rattling scream of twin General Electric F414 turbofan engines. A lethal, perfectly synchronized symphony of Boeing FA-18 Super Hornets and Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters were violently catapulted into the black sky. The F-35C is not just a fighter jet. It is a flying supersonic supercomputer that makes fourth-generation fighters look like outdated typewriters. While the heavy Super Hornets remained low, the F-35 stealth fighters immediately soared to an altitude of 40,000 feet, acting as completely invisible, omniscient sensors in the stratosphere. At 3:58 in the morning, the United States executed a daring, hyper-aggressive infiltration. Using the massive, mile-high plume of toxic black smoke rising from the burning supertanker as a physical tactical blind spot, United States Navy SEAL teams operating on low-profile stealth insertion craft moved silently toward the Iranian coastline. They were heavily armed ghosts moving through the thick soot, slipping completely undetected past the Iranian shore defenses to paint high-value coastal radar sites with infrared targeting lasers. By 4:05 in the morning, the Iranian command structure realized they were completely exposed. Their response was desperate and immediate. They launched their most advanced asymmetrical weapons, fiber optic guided suicide drones. These are the silent snipers of the sky. Because these drones physically trail a microscopic thread of glass fiber optic cable all the way back to their launch point, they do not emit any radio frequencies. This makes them entirely immune to traditional American electronic jamming. It was a highly clever, low-tech solution against the world's most advanced electronic warfare jammers. But the United States Navy was already 3 steps ahead. From the vertical launch cells of the American destroyers, Raytheon evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, the Block II variant, screeched out of their armored silos with blinding flashes of fire. Unlike older, traditional missiles, the Block II features a highly advanced dual-mode seeker that can track and destroy a target even if it is flying mere feet above the water, hiding in the chaotic radar clutter of the crashing waves. The dark horizon was instantly painted in blinding shards of burning magnesium and explosive fire as the Iranian drones were swatted out of the sky. And while the Iranian drone operators were still staring at their blank, static-filled remote control screens in subterranean bunkers, the F-35 stealth fighters orbiting at 40,000 feet had already used their electro-optical targeting systems to trace the fiber optic cables straight back to their source. They triangulated the exact GPS coordinates of the hidden Iranian launch bunkers. The invisible American snipers in the sky had already won the war before the first Iranian operator could even blink. At 4:15 in the morning, while the surface of the Persian Gulf was a chaotic, burning theater of fire, the shallow seabed remained a chilling tomb of absolute silence. Iran's Ghadir-class midget submarines, rugged, reverse-engineered North Korean technology specifically optimized for the shallow, muddy floor of the Gulf, performed a highly aggressive cold soak maneuver. The submarine captains completely killed their diesel-electric engines, allowing their vessels to drift silently along the bottom like cold boulders, making them completely invisible to standard American passive sonar arrays. Simultaneously, natural underwater currents began pushing hundreds of magnetic limpet mines, explosives designed to tear right through reinforced steel hull plating, directly toward the United States Fifth Fleet formation. At 4:22 in the morning, the terrifying silence was shattered by a mechanical grind beneath the dark waves. A Ghadir submarine had successfully bypassed the outer American acoustic net and was currently sitting just 2 nautical miles from a United States Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. Its heavy torpedo tubes were hydraulically opening, preparing for a devastating, point-blank strike. The American response was not just instantaneous, it was surgical. Scrambling from the aft flight deck of the destroyer, an MH-60R Seahawk, the United States Navy's absolute premier anti-submarine hunting platform, had already been loitering in a low-altitude hover, anticipating the trap. This multi-mission hunter, built by Sikorsky, aggressively unspooled its Raytheon AQS-22 dipping sonar directly into the dark depths. The massive sonar transducer pulsed, sending high-frequency acoustic pings through the darkness, hitting the titanium hull of the Iranian submarine with the undeniable, terrifying force of a digital hammer. But the United States did not just fire a torpedo back, they isolated the threat completely. An EA-18G Growler, an incredibly advanced electronic warfare aircraft, already loitering at 25,000 feet as part of the Abraham Lincoln strike package, banked sharply into a steep dive. The Growler unleashed a surgical, heavily concentrated spot jamming strike directly onto the specific very low-frequency communication relays used by Tehran's Shore Command. The American electronic warfare officers did not have to physically crush the submarine. They just had to completely silence the voice of God from the mainland. The massive electromagnetic surge instantly severed the submarine's umbilical cord to its land-based commanders. In a terrifying instant, the Iranian captain was entirely cut off. He was left completely blind, entirely deaf, and paralyzed in a dark steel coffin, just heartbeats before he could pull the trigger. The apex predator of the deep was no longer hunting. It was permanently trapped in the crushing weight of its own absolute silence. At 4:35 in the morning, as the FA-18 Super Hornets methodically cleared the last of the conventional suicide drones from the night sky, the United States military moved from applying brute kinetic force to a much more terrifying psychological phase. They began entirely rewriting the reality of the battlefield. The EA-18G Growlers, acting essentially as flying electromagnetic guillotines, began striking directly at the central nervous system of the Iranian military. Instead of simply blinding the Iranian coastal radars with massive walls of static white noise, the American operators initiated digital radio frequency memory. Think of this technology as a digital hall of mirrors or a malicious photocopier working on overdrive. The American aircraft captured the incoming Iranian radar pulses, perfectly cloned them, and beamed them back at the Iranian receivers with a microscopic, carefully calculated delay. The consequence on the ground was pure, unadulterated, screaming panic. On the green radar screens inside the Iranian command bunkers, the modest United States task force suddenly, inexplicably cloned itself. It blossomed into a massive, terrifying armada of over 100 American warships charging directly at the coastline. It was a digital phantom fleet, appearing and disappearing at physically impossible speeds. Terrified Iranian coastal missile battery commanders, believing they were facing the largest naval invasion since the Second World War, began frantically firing their precious, highly expensive stockpiles of surface-to-air and anti-ship missiles straight into the empty night sky. They were completely emptying a $200 million magazine of advanced weaponry into the dark clouds, furiously engaging digital ghosts created by a few lines of highly classified American computer code. For Tehran, it was a lethal, humiliating guessing game, where the only prize was an entirely empty munitions warehouse. At 4:42 in the morning, the total collapse of the Iranian network was absolute. Inside the Iranian technical units, the smartest engineers finally realized the terrifying truth. Their digital logic loops were failing. As their targeting coordinates jumped wildly across their maps, they screamed into their radios, ordering their missile units to immediately go dark, to physically shut down the automated defense systems, and switch to manual visual control. But it was already entirely too late. The United States Cyber Command had already embedded a highly malicious 90-second countdown to zero directly into the Iranian network architecture. In those final 90 seconds, the entire Iranian integrated air defense grid was effectively forced lights out. Their most valuable strategic assets were left completely exposed, blind, and defenseless. The heavily fortified door to the Iranian mainland was no longer just ajar. It was completely blown off its steel hinges, entirely cleared for the final, devastating finishing blow. At 4:45 in the morning, before the first Tomahawk cruise missile even cleared its vertical launch cell on the Arleigh Burke destroyers, the final sentence of the Iranian military had already been written from low Earth orbit. The KH-11 Keyhole satellite emerged from the dark side of the planet. Using its ultra-advanced infrared sensors, it captured the thermal heartbeat of Iran's deepest underground command centers. It mapped the massive heat blooming from their deep-buried diesel power generators. This fresh, undeniable intelligence turned what Tehran proudly thought were completely impenetrable subterranean fortresses into glowing, unmistakable bullseyes on every single American targeting screen. Leveraging this perfectly clean data, the United States Navy unleashed a massive swarm of Raytheon Tomahawk land attack missiles. These are not just missiles, they are low-flying, entirely autonomous robotic assassins. They surged inland, dropping low over the coastline, threading perfectly through narrow mountain canyons to completely decapitate the Iranian drone command nodes and strategic missile silos with surgical, violent finality. At 4:55 in the morning, with the dreaded Iranian S-300 air defense batteries entirely neutralized by the F-35 stealth fighters, the Iranian sky was no longer a heavily restricted no-go zone. It was a completely uncontested American playground, utilizing the invisible, blind corridor carved out by the electronic warfare units. Thousands of elite American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, the undisputed tip of the American spear, executed a lightning-fast insertion directly onto the Iranian coast. They did not need weeks of preparation. They were the dagger violently thrust into the open wound, physically seizing the very sites the Tomahawks had just crippled, effectively slamming the door shut on any potential Iranian counteroffensive. But while the entire world's attention was fixed on the burning inferno and the chaotic firefights along the Strait of Hormuz, the true monster of the American arsenal remained completely invisible. Dropping down from the freezing, invisible edge of the stratosphere, Northrop Grumman's B-2 Spirit, a $2 billion flying ghost, emerged from the dark shadow of a low-level storm cell. While the Iranian radar grid was still screaming into the digital hall of mirrors, the heavy stealth bomber slipped completely undetected deep into the Iranian interior. Iran was not an inherently weak military. They were simply masterfully manipulated into turning on all their lights to defend their coast, unintentionally illuminating their most sacred, highly classified strategic assets in the process. With absolute impunity, the B-2 Spirit opened its massive payload doors and deployed multiple GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators. These 30,000-pound GPS-guided bunker busters plummeted toward the Earth, perfectly striking the most heavily fortified nuclear facilities and strategic missile silos hidden deep inside the mountains. Iran only truly realized the devastating gravity of their fatal mistake when their deepest, most heavily guarded defense architecture completely vanished from their communication networks in a series of earth-shattering subterranean explosions. In under 30 minutes, the entire grand provocation had totally collapsed. Iran thought they were playing a high-stakes game of geopolitical poker, completely unaware that the United States military had already seen every single card in their deck. The drone strike on the supertanker was never the beginning of an Iranian victory. It was the exact pretext the United States needed to forcefully finish the game. The Fifth Fleet did not go blindly hunting for targets in the dark. They patiently lured Iran into lighting the candle of their own absolute destruction. Tehran thought they had secured a brilliant tactical victory. Instead, they had personally handed the United States Navy an exclusive VIP ticket to their own funeral. Just another morning in the Persian Gulf. The sun rises over the burning oil fields. The thick black smoke slowly clears, and the absolute hierarchy of global power is violently reestablished.